And welcome to part 2 of the Developing a US National PID Strategy series. My name is John Chodacki, and I'm joined with my ORFG PID Strategy Group co-chair, Todd Carpenter. In this part of our series, we will talk a little bit more about the unique context of PIDs in the US and discuss the project that we did with ORFG and RDA-US in more detail. To discuss anything around persistent identifiers infrastructure, of course, by their own nature, all technology and persistent identifiers are global, but of course, when we're looking at policy and discussions about the context within the US landscape, we want to really think about what is the impact of PIDs within our research ecosystem and how we can work together to develop recommendations for improving that, both strategic and policy decisions and discussions, as well as tactical implementations. Persistent identifiers, as we've discussed previously, and as many of you probably already know, provide a foundation for a lot of the tracking and cataloging and discovery of research outputs within the scholarly space. Many of us know that persistent identifiers are not only identifiers and strings, but they're also impactful because of the metadata that is attached to those strings. And so when we're thinking about how persistent identifiers can help the US research community in developing and adopting better practices, we really want to think about how the implementation of not only persistent identifiers as unique identifiers, but also the underlying metadata that they are attached to can help in many different diverse use cases. Just like other countries, the United States has a very robust research community. However, in the United States, there is a unique context that does bring together both public and private and academic and businesses and funding communities and government agencies to think about when we're trying to develop a national strategy. And so with the project that we did together with members of our working group, hosted by ORFG and by RDA-US, we went through a consistent policy process, as Todd mentioned in the previous series, that included working with ORFG, the Open Research Funders Group, Helios Open, which is hosted by Spark, as well as looking at work that had been done by the RDA National PID Strategies Interest Group. Through a process of community calls and working group meetings and stakeholder consultations, we were able to tease out many of the items that were discussed in the previous slide around what really makes the US context unique and how persistent identifiers could be leveraged appropriately. And so the purpose of this work was really to define desirable characteristics of what persistent identifiers and systems and metadata would be, and to build those desirable characteristics into recommendations. And so this was a process that included drafting documentation and drafting recommendations and publishing them out. And as you'll see here at the link, there is the current report that's available on Zenodo, and we are currently circulating those recommendations for further consultation within the US and internationally. The goal from all this work is to then package this up and present it as a NISO working group that can focus on, in a more consultative fashion, a more robust and comprehensive fashion, through a standards process can develop and publish out a formal recommendation for a national PID strategy.
Great, thanks, John. One of the key elements of what we were trying to achieve with this document and the working group that developed it was to put together key components of what we thought to be elements of a national PID strategy. Obviously, these components will go through much more rigorous vetting through a NISO process, but these were the core elements that the community focused on in that initial draft, which John mentioned as it being available in Zenodo. The first is on the need for embracing persistent identifiers across all elements of our community and trying to encourage widespread adoption of persistent identifiers throughout the ecosystem, from funding organizations to researchers and research institutions and the publishers that disseminate that research. Wanted to focus deeply into the desirable characteristics of persistent identifiers. We'll get into these in more detail later in the series, but highlighting the need that those persistent identifiers be open, persistent, resolvable, and interoperable is key to making them effective and reliable for the research community. We also looked at strategic recommendations around enhancing persistent identifier infrastructure, core PID services, so the types of things that research infrastructure providers are facilitating through the services that they provide, how to transition the community beyond legacy systems that exist. We've been using persistent identifiers for decades, but how do we promote centralized PID systems, centralized PID management of existing systems? We don't want to create a new system, but what we want to do is make sure that that existing system is interoperable and focusing its attention in meaningful ways. We also recognize that there are certainly needs for additional investment and support in this ecosystem, both financially as well as technically. And then looking forward, how do we measure success? What are approaches to assess the impact of this US national strategy through things like adoption rates, interoperability, and ideally the advancement of research integrity and efficiency? For more information about this entire project, we've been as open as we can be with as we've developed this. There is, as John mentioned, the Zenodo link where you can get the actual report. There is a blog post on the Force 11 website focused on desirable characteristics of persistent identifiers. There is also a blog post on the Scholarly Kitchen website, as well as an ongoing community discussion related to the National PID Strategy in this report. We're trying, as John said, to bring these recommendations out to the community and foster greater conversation. And the PID Forum is one area where we can continue this ongoing conversation. As we draw part 2 of this, we want to reflect on some of the things that you've learned and some questions that you can ask yourself in terms of what difficulties have you had in publishing digital artifacts, either as a researcher or in cross-institutional efforts that you or your organization might be involved in. And then think about how a national PID strategy might benefit from these collaborations. And as we draw this session to a close, we want to acknowledge the work of the Research Data Alliance team through the Pervasive Technology Institute at Indiana University, as well as the TIGRUS facilitation program that's part of the RDA-US. We also want to acknowledge the support of the Open Research Funders Group, Helios Open, and Spark. Thank you. We'll draw this session to a close and look forward to seeing you in the next installment of this series.